My friends, I want to begin today with a difficult confession about a relationship I allowed into my life in my late 60s, one that cost me more, both financially and emotionally, than almost any other single relationship of my adult years, precisely because I possessed exactly the kind of trusting, generous disposition that made me genuinely unable to recognize warning signs that, looking back now, seem almost embarrassingly obvious. A new acquaintance entered my social circle through a mutual friend, charming, attentive, and seemingly quite taken with my company from our very first conversation. Over the course of roughly 18 months, this relationship gradually cost me a significant sum of money, considerable emotional energy, and, ultimately, my trust in my own judgment for a considerable period afterward. I want to be honest with you that every single warning sign was genuinely present from very early in this relationship, signs that several concerned friends gently pointed out to me at various points, signs I dismissed each time with some reasonable-sounding explanation that allowed me to continue trusting someone I genuinely wanted to believe in. It was only in the painful aftermath, working with a counselor to understand how I had allowed this particular situation to unfold so thoroughly, that I finally recognized a clear, consistent pattern across not only this relationship, but several other difficult relationships across my own life where I had extended trust considerably longer than the actual evidence in front of me ever genuinely warranted. I want to share with you today the 7 specific red flags I have come to recognize, both through this particular painful experience and through careful observation of similar situations affecting other genuinely kind, trusting people in my own community. Red flags that kind, generous people are particularly prone to dismissing precisely because our own good character makes us reluctant to assume the worst about someone else's genuine intentions. This is not a lesson suggesting you should become suspicious, cynical, or withdrawn from new relationships and connections. It is a lesson about recognizing specific, consistent patterns that deserve serious attention rather than the generous benefit of the doubt that kind people, myself very much included, are naturally inclined to extend far longer than genuine wisdom actually recommends. The first red flag: they are only genuinely warm and attentive when they need something from you. I want to begin with what I now recognize as one of the clearest and most consistently present red flags across nearly every difficult relationship I have examined honestly, a pattern in which someone's genuine warmth and attentiveness fluctuates noticeably and predictably in direct correlation with whether they currently need something from you. The acquaintance I described earlier displayed remarkable warmth and interest during periods when a request for financial assistance or some other favor was imminent or recently granted, warmth that would then noticeably cool during the intervening periods when no immediate need existed. I recognized, examining this pattern honestly in hindsight, that I had actually noticed this fluctuation quite early in the relationship, dismissing it at the time with explanations about his busy schedule or his own private struggles that made his attention understandably inconsistent. What I failed to properly weigh was the remarkable, consistent correlation between his warmth and his current need, a pattern that, examined honestly rather than generously explained away, revealed itself clearly as transactional rather than genuinely relational in nature. I have since learned to pay considerably closer attention to whether someone's warmth toward me remains reasonably consistent regardless of whether they currently need anything from me, rather than accepting my own generous explanations for a pattern of warmth that reliably intensifies immediately before a request and cools immediately afterward. This particular red flag, I have come to believe, is one of the more reliable indicators available, precisely because it requires no assumption about someone's private thoughts or motivations, simply careful observation of an actual, consistent behavioral pattern occurring directly in front of you. I found it useful, once I finally recognized this pattern clearly, to develop a simple mental practice for future relationships, mentally noting, over a period of several months, whether a new acquaintance's warmth genuinely correlated with anything other than their own current need. This small practice, requiring nothing more than honest, patient observation over time, revealed considerably more about a person's genuine character than any single pleasant conversation or charming first impression ever could, precisely because it could not be faked consistently across many months without an eventual, revealing correlation becoming apparent to anyone genuinely willing to look for it. The second red flag: they never genuinely apologize, only explain, or deflect. The second red flag I identified was a consistent pattern in which this same acquaintance, when confronted with any genuine mistake or hurtful behavior, never once offered a direct, unqualified apology, instead consistently providing lengthy explanations, deflections towards circumstances beyond his control, or subtle redirections of responsibility back toward me or toward other external factors entirely. I recalled numerous instances where clearly hurtful or inappropriate behavior was met, not with a simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but with an elaborate justification that somehow always concluded with the situation being nobody's fault in particular, or occasionally, uncomfortably, being at least partially my own fault for having reacted the way I did. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognize that a person's willingness to offer genuine, direct apology when they have genuinely erred represents one of the clearest available windows into their actual character and capacity for genuine accountability. The complete absence of this capacity across an extended relationship, replaced consistently by explanation and deflection, should have registered as a considerably more serious warning than I permitted it to register at the time, distracted as I was by the genuine charm and apparent warmth this same person displayed during our more pleasant interactions. I have since learned to pay close attention specifically to how a person responds when directly, calmly confronted with a genuine mistake affecting me, watching carefully for whether a direct, simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing ever actually occurs, or whether every such conversation instead produces only explanation, deflection, and subtle redirection of responsibility elsewhere. This particular pattern, I have come to believe, reveals considerably more about someone's genuine character than almost any other single behavior I might otherwise observe across the more pleasant, uncomplicated portions of an ordinary relationship. I recall, in particular, one specific conversation that should have alerted me considerably sooner than it actually did, a conversation in which I gently raised a genuine hurt his behavior had caused, only to find myself, by the conversation's conclusion, somehow apologizing to him for having raised the concern in the first place. This particular dynamic, in which raising a legitimate grievance somehow always concluded with my own apology rather than his, occurred with such striking regularity across our relationship that I now recognize it as one of the clearest possible signals available, a genuine skill at redirecting accountability that I mistook, at the time, for simple miscommunication rather than the deliberate, practiced pattern it likely actually was. The third red flag. They gradually, persistently test and push against boundaries you have clearly stated. The third red flag I identified was a pattern in which this same acquaintance consistently, gradually tested boundaries I had explicitly and clearly stated, never through any single dramatic violation, but through a slow, persistent series of small encroachments, each one minor enough on its own to seem unworthy of serious concern, but cumulatively revealing a genuine disregard for limits I had communicated plainly on numerous occasions. I recalled stating clearly, early in our relationship, specific financial limits I was comfortable extending, limits that were nonetheless gradually and repeatedly tested through escalating requests over the following months. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognize that a person who genuinely respects another person's stated boundaries generally does not require these boundaries to be repeated and reinforced constantly, nor do they typically test these boundaries through a slow, persistent series of minor encroachments designed, whether consciously or not, to gradually expand what they can reasonably request without triggering serious pushback. The consistent, gradual testing I experienced across this relationship should have registered as a clear pattern considerably earlier than it actually did, distracted as I was by treating each individual instance as an isolated, minor matter rather than recognizing the clear cumulative pattern they collectively revealed. I have since learned to pay careful attention to whether a stated boundary is genuinely respected going forward, or whether it instead becomes the subject of repeated, gradual testing through a series of individually minor encroachments that nonetheless reveal, when considered together honestly, a clear and troubling disregard for limits I have already communicated plainly and directly. I found it helpful, in the aftermath of this particular relationship, to begin keeping a simple, honest mental note whenever I stated a genuine boundary going forward, specifically tracking whether this boundary was respected consistently or whether it instead became the subject of gradual, repeated testing over subsequent weeks and months. This small practice revealed, in several subsequent relationships, a clear and immediate difference between people who genuinely respected a stated limit without requiring it to be repeated, and people who treated a stated boundary as merely an opening position in an ongoing negotiation, a distinction that proved considerably more reliable than my own earlier tendency to simply hope, without genuine verification, that a stated boundary had been properly understood and would be properly honored. Going forward. The fourth red flag. They gradually position themselves as your primary source of support, subtly discouraging other relationships. The fourth red flag I identified was a gradual, subtle pattern in which this same acquaintance positioned himself, over time, as an increasingly central figure in my daily life and decision-making, while simultaneously offering subtle, deniable criticism of several other important relationships in my life, criticism that had the cumulative effect of gradually increasing my reliance on his own counsel and company while diminishing my engagement with other relationships that might otherwise have offered genuine, independent perspective on the situation developing between us. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that this particular relative isolation had developed so gradually that I had never once consciously registered it as a coordinated pattern, experiencing instead only a series of individually reasonable-seeming remarks about various friends and family members, remarks that nonetheless, considered together across many months, had gradually reduced the number of independent voices in my life who might otherwise have recognized and named the concerning pattern, developing considerably sooner than my own increasingly isolated perspective ultimately allowed. I have since learned to pay careful, ongoing attention to whether a new relationship in my life is accompanied by a gradual reduction in my engagement with other important relationships, and to specifically notice any pattern of subtle, deniable criticism directed toward the people who might otherwise offer genuine, independent perspective on a developing situation. This particular red flag, I have come to believe, is among the more dangerous precisely because it operates so gradually and so deniably that recognizing it in real time, rather than only in painful hindsight, requires considerably more deliberate vigilance than most of the other patterns I have described to you today. I want to share a small, practical safeguard I have adopted since this experience, one that I believe genuinely protects against this particular pattern more reliably than my own in-the-moment judgment alone. I now make a deliberate point, whenever a significant new relationship enters my life, of maintaining regular, unhurried contact with at least 2 or 3 of my oldest, most trusted relationships, specifically resisting any subtle pull toward reducing this contact regardless of how compellingly a new relationship's demands on my time and attention might seem to justify it. This simple safeguard preserves exactly the kind of independent, outside perspective that a gradually isolating relationship works, whether deliberately or not, to quietly diminish over time. The 5th red flag: they treat service workers, strangers, or people with no power over them noticeably differently than they treat you. The 5th red flag I identified, one I recognized only in hindsight despite having witnessed clear evidence of it on several occasions throughout our relationship, was a consistent pattern in which this same acquaintance treated waitstaff, retail employees, and other people in positions with no power over him noticeably differently, considerably more dismissively and impatiently, than he treated me and other people whose opinion of him genuinely mattered to his own interests. I recalled several specific instances of this differential treatment that I noticed at the time, but dismissed as simply an unfortunate but ultimately unimportant character quirk unrelated to how he treated me directly. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognize that how a person treats individuals who hold no power over their own interests or reputation reveals considerably more about their genuine character than how they treat people whose good opinion they have active reason to cultivate and maintain. This particular pattern, I have since come to believe, may be among the single most reliable indicators available to any of us, precisely because it reveals behavior offered without any of the strategic incentive that shapes how a person treats those whose approval genuinely matters to their own interests. I have since learned to pay close, deliberate attention specifically to how a new acquaintance treats waitstaff, service employees, and other people who hold no power over their own interests, treating this particular behavior as considerably more diagnostic of genuine character than nearly any other single pattern I might otherwise observe during the more pleasant, socially incentivized portions of a developing relationship. I recall, in particular, one specific dinner early in this relationship when he spoke to a young waiter with a sharpness and impatience that genuinely startled me at the time, behavior I quickly excused to myself as simply a bad moment brought on by a long day, rather than recognizing it as a genuine, revealing glimpse of how he treated people whose good opinion carried no strategic value to him. I have since come to believe that this single dinner contained more genuine information about his actual character than the many months of charming, attentive conversation directed at me across the remainder of our relationship, information I simply was not yet prepared to properly weigh at the time it was first offered to me so plainly. The 6th red flag: their account of past relationships consistently positions them as the blameless victim. The 6th red flag I identified was a consistent pattern, revealed gradually across numerous conversations about this same acquaintance's past relationships and professional history, in which he positioned himself, without exception, as the entirely blameless victim of unreasonable former friends, unfair employers, and misunderstanding family members, a pattern in which not a single past conflict, across an entire adult lifetime of relationships, ever seemed to involve any genuine fault or contribution on his own part whatsoever. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognize that a person's account of their own past conflicts, when this account consistently and without exception positions them as the entirely blameless party across every single relationship throughout their adult life, should register as a considerably more serious warning sign than I permitted it to register at the time. Genuine, honest self-reflection about one's own past mistakes and contributions to previous conflicts is, I have come to believe, a reasonably reliable marker of genuine emotional maturity, and its complete and consistent absence across an entire relationship history deserves considerably more serious attention than the sympathetic, generous interpretation I extended to this pattern for far too long. I have since learned to pay careful attention to how a new acquaintance describes past conflicts and relationships, specifically noticing whether their account ever includes genuine acknowledgement of their own contribution or fault, or whether it instead consistently positions them as the entirely blameless victim of an unbroken series of unreasonable, unfair, or misunderstanding others across their entire adult history. I find it worth noting, too, that this particular pattern is genuinely distinct from someone occasionally, honestly describing a situation in which they were genuinely wronged, which happens to every person across an ordinary life and does not by itself indicate any troubling pattern. What concerned me, examining this honestly in hindsight, was the sheer, unbroken consistency of the pattern, an entire adult history recounted across numerous conversations in which not a single relationship, however distant in time or circumstance, ever seemed to include even the smallest acknowledgement of his own genuine contribution to whatever conflict had eventually ended it. The 7th red flag: your own trusted friends and family express concern, and you find yourself consistently defending the person they are concerned about. The 7th and final red flag I identified, and perhaps the one I regret most deeply having dismissed, was the genuine, repeated concern expressed by several trusted friends and family members across the course of this relationship. Concern I consistently met with defensive explanations on this acquaintance's behalf rather than genuine. Open consideration of what these trusted people, observing the relationship with considerably more independent perspective than my own increasingly compromised viewpoint, were actually trying to tell me. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that I had positioned myself, across many months, as this particular acquaintance's defender against the genuine concerns of people who had known and loved me for decades, people with no personal stake whatsoever in the outcome of this particular relationship beyond their own genuine care for my well-being. This defensive posture, adopted repeatedly and consistently in response to multiple independent expressions of concern from multiple trusted people in my life, should have registered as one of the clearest possible warning signs available, considerably more reliable than my own increasingly compromised judgment about the relationship itself. I have since learned to treat consistent, independent concern from multiple trusted people in my life as a genuinely serious signal deserving careful, honest consideration, rather than continuing my old pattern of defending the person of concern against people who, in every single instance I have since examined honestly, were seeing the actual situation considerably more clearly than I was capable of seeing it myself at the time. I want to share, in particular, a specific memory of my own daughter expressing concern to me directly, gently but clearly, roughly a year into this relationship, a conversation I recall responding to with genuine irritation at what I experienced, at the time, as her unwarranted interference in my own personal life. Looking back now, I recognize that her concern was based on considerably more objective observation than my own increasingly compromised perspective allowed me to maintain, and I have since made a point of thanking her directly for the courage it took to raise this concern with me despite my own defensive reaction at the time. A defensive reaction I now understand as itself one of the clearest warning signs I failed to properly recognize throughout this entire difficult experience. My friends, I want to be honest with you that recognizing these 7 red flags, clearly and in writing as I have done for you today, feels considerably different than recognizing them in the actual, lived moment of an unfolding relationship, when genuine warmth, charm, and the sincere hope that a new connection will prove genuinely valuable all combine to make dismissing each individual warning sign feel entirely reasonable in isolation. I do not believe I am, by nature, a particularly gullible or poor judge of character. I believe, instead, that my own genuine kindness and generosity of spirit, qualities I do not wish to abandon or apologize for, made me specifically vulnerable to exactly this particular pattern of gradual, individually explainable warning signs that only reveal their true, troubling significance when considered together, honestly, rather than dismissed one at a time as isolated, forgivable exceptions. I think often of the considerable cost this particular relationship ultimately extracted from me, financially, emotionally, and in terms of my own confidence in my ability to judge new relationships accurately for a considerable period afterward. I do not share this experience to frighten you away from genuine openness and generosity toward new people in your life, qualities I continue to believe represent some of the finest aspects of a genuinely well-lived life. I share it because I believe kind, generous people, precisely because of our own good character, are particularly susceptible to exactly this pattern of gradually dismissed warning signs, and I believe naming these particular patterns clearly, as I have attempted to do today, offers a genuine measure of protection that our own generous, hopeful nature alone cannot always reliably provide. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in a current relationship, even 1 or 2 of these 7 red flags I have described, I want you to know that noticing this pattern does not require you to become suspicious or withdrawn from new people in your life generally. It simply requires a willingness to weigh these particular patterns honestly, alongside whatever genuine warmth and charm you may also be experiencing, rather than allowing that warmth and charm to consistently outweigh clear, accumulating evidence that deserves your serious, honest attention. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize these particular patterns considerably sooner in your own life than I managed to recognize them in mine, and gives you the confidence to trust your own careful observation and the honest concern of the people who love you, even when a new relationship's genuine warmth makes dismissing these warning signs feel entirely reasonable in the moment. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Remain genuinely kind and open, but pair that kindness with honest, clear-eyed attention to the patterns that matter most. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay kind, stay clear-eyed, and remember, the warning signs we dismiss individually often tell a very different, considerably more important story when we finally have the courage to consider them together. Thank you for watching.